hear more about her research. And welcome, Irina.
Thank you, Karol, very much for this generous introduction. Today I would like to talk about a topic which is for me a kind of a work in progress, and I still have a lot of more questions than answers. And I was pushing away this topic for quite a long time, but I still have had to deal with that. It concerns ethical issues in Muratova cinema. And I would like to start, I will probably give you some idea of the theoretical background I have to work with while addressing these issues. And I will start with the French medievalist Jean-Claude Schmitt, who has shown that in the Occidental culture, gestures were conceived of in a prescriptive and normative manner. There were good and bad gestures serving as extreme external signs of internal good or bad intentions. In other words, gestures were to be deciphered as a manifestation of moral inwardness. Gestures belonged to the body and therefore were mistrusted. A good Christian was educated to control her body and movements. So excessive gestures signaled bad manners, a lack of modesty, humility, low-born origins, and were condemned as a sign of sinful inner life. According to this logic of gestures, moderate gestus was opposed to the demonic gesticulation. Milan Kundera shared a similar observation regarding classical sculpture and painting, where laughter and an open mouth were seen as an expression of vice. Faces lost their immovability. Mouth became open only when the painter wished to express evil. A different approach was adopted by George Agamben in his famous Notes on Gesture, and most recently in Karman, a brief treatise on action, guilt, and gesture. Agamben explicitly inscribes gesture into the sphere of ethical and political action, but as is known, he understands action in a particular way. Agamben challenges Aristotle's distinction between poiesis, production, and praxis, action, and refers to the Roman scholar Varro, who introduced a third type of action expressed by the verb gerere, which means neither acting nor producing, but carrying, from the word gereria. In gesture, nothing is being produced or acted, but rather something is being endured and supported. So we sense in this definition some passion or suffering and responsibility for the other. Gesture is placed between passivity and activity. It is here that the term inoperativity appears, since carrying on escapes the category of purposiveness altogether. Gesture ideally can never be accomplished, for it is an exhibition of endless possibilities of the media character of corporal movements. Gesture is the endurance and, as such, is reserved for sovereigns and for mimes and for all dancers. That's what Agamben says. So Agamben expands his gestural analysis from political action to philosophy, art, poetry, dance, and of course cinema, which for him is carrying out a messianic task of preserving and archiving humanity's gestures. Praxis, human life, is not a trial, an actio, but rather a mysterion in the theatrical sense of the term, made of gestures and words. Muratova's gestural vocabulary is neither modest nor restrained, nor does it seem to have any purposefulness except for merely displaying bodily motilities, postures, shapes, or sounds. The film plots are constantly interrupted by the characters acting out, dancing, singing, reciting poems, grimacing, or conjuring circus tricks, and so on. There is always a vestige of inexplicability of those divertissements, purposiveness without purpose, exhibiting of pure mediality of gesture in the wake of Agamben's teaching. Following the legacy of Soviet utopian humanist project, film critics often accuse Muratova of misanthropy, anti-humanism, even immorality, especially after the release of 1997 film Three Stories, in which Muratova steps on a shaky ground of depicting homicide with neither punishment or sense of guilt. So the film depicts three murders committed by a man, by a woman, and by a 5-year-old girl. Yeah, by a woman and a 5-year-old girl. who, by the way, poisons her elderly babysitter or landlord, and what kind of reverses the standard logic of perpetration. The child isn't a victim of violence, but the perpetrator. The film caused quite a straightforward, if not unreflected, adverse reaction, even among scanty admirers of Muratova's art. She was reproached for not having enough compassion and love towards human beings. And one of her protagonists, a morbid declaration, has been often evoked to impute to Muratova some sort of ethical obliteration and even put in a nutshell her artistic credo. I don't love men, I don't love women, I don't love children, I don't like people, I give this planet a 0. But it wasn't the first time that Muratova was probing into the precarious area of moral ambiguity. Many of her films unfold unresolved ethical situations, such as love triangles, infidelity or promiscuity, child abandonment, deception and fraud, ambiguous hints at incest, sexual abuse, and zoophilia. Oh, can't see that very well. Kidnapping, murders, and even humorously sexism and cannibalism. Like, for instance, in this highly disturbing declaration of the nouveau riche in the film Minor People. He comments apropos a dismembered female body found by the police in his neighborhood. Women shouldn't be killed, they should be raped. This is normal, the nature of things. Women are weaker physically, there are more of them, so as men could rape and impregnate them. And so would the humankind continue. And basically, if you kill and cut up someone, then boil and eat it, don't throw it away. In the film, Change of Fate, which is set in some indistinct Central Asian area, we hear some provocatively racist remarks voiced by the jail warden. We are all civilized people. White people should be friends. They should be in solidarity with each other. I can't stand indigenous women. Only a white woman is a woman, and he repeats it twice. Formally, those are white too, but somewhat yellowish. But the power of provocation consists not in the fact that such statements appear at all, but in that they are not properly framed by any critical authorial distance. Muratova's handling of ethical issues allows no moralization whatsoever, but the film narrative does not offer any expected outcome either. So the crimes remain neither punished nor condemned, hostile remarks do not provoke any reaction, fraud is denied by the victims, and so on and so on. So the provocative utterances are emitted but not reflected on. In Agamben STEM, we are faced here in inoperative ethics. So my interpretation is twofold, but in both cases it pertains to Muratova's treatment of language, debunked of its status of a means of communication, knowledge or cognition. First, the speech in her films is organized the speech in her films is organized as an endless circulation of cliches, of the socialist rhetoric, of Russian literature, of trivial set expressions, fragments of popular songs, and so on and so on. The characters become impersonal speaking automata. Nancy Conde argues that Muratova's characters are not so much people or identities as fragments left behind from the world's conversations, or put differently, disconnected utterances. The produced effect of this accumulation is pretty obvious. The absurdity and immorality of the cliches become ostensive by excess. One of examples, it's from the film Minor People. I will let it. One of the characters remarks on the view of passing by patients of a psychiatric facility. Here are those you can envy. They wash them, feed them, sing them a song and put in bed. No need to worry about anything. What else does one need? Oh, knock on food, oh, knock on wood. What am I talking about, Lord? So she corrects herself immediately. What am I talking about? So the second explanation concerns the primacy of discourse over action. The words possess a kind of magic power. The words possess a kind of magic power to become immediately reified, materialized in flesh. Even death results from this reversal of word and act. It appears as a contingent, aleatoric effect of a discourse, something what Ilya was talking about, performativity. For example, Vera in Minor People is being angry about her drinking and violent partner. She screams a discursive cliche. If only you were dead, he will kill you. And the man next moment falls dead. And also from another example from the same movie, the new Russian, so-called, engages into an endless discussion with his bodyguard about who of them and how should murder another criminal, who at this very moment is hidden in the boot of the car. Both men are having their reasons not to kill. The nouveau riche explains that he is a former Russian literature teacher, and the grand narrative of Russian literature consists in the claim to some moral supremacy, pervading all social spheres. In Muratova, this discourse on myth is debunked as trivial as any other cliche. After a long debate, it comes out that the guy has already died by himself of asphyxiation. Although a hypothetical murder fails, by the same token, it turns into a real death, rendering the concept of crime impossible to define in terms of guilt. Words kill without fail, unlike actions. Yeah, that's another example from 3 stories. I will skip. In short, words turn out to be useless and omnipotent at the same time. And this undecidability on the part of discourse underscores that language is not the channel of ethical articulation in Muratova. There is, however, at least one exception from this rule, the only time when the authorial, non-ironic voice interfered the flux of image. And it was in the well-known and heartbreaking documentary footage of a canine shelter in Astenic syndrome. That's also the title of our conference. People don't like to look at this. People don't like to think about this. This is not supposed to have a relation to discussions of good and evil. My next point is titled Ethics of Perpetration. So this kind of exploration of discourse and with its drawbacks makes Muratova a typical postmodernist. However, something interesting happens on the way, namely when the figure of a perpetrator begins to loom, and it's notably that it's a female figure. First, it occurs in film Change of Fate during Perestroika. The female protagonist, Maria, accused of a murder, succeeds at convincing the court that she committed this murder in self-defense, although she kills her lover out of jealousy. So Maria prepares a perfect make-believe story on the level of discourse and seems to be in control of the situation. But one little slip, the letter, and just as in Nabokov's Despair, a perfectly plotted self-defense murder is disclosed at one's dash. But the most striking type of impunity arrives later in the 90s, in the gestural and comical femme fatale enacted by Renata Litvinova, some kind of authorially privileged figure in the sense that she seeks to control exactly and manipulate the diegesis. So she's also a co-author of several films. But what is crucial for my discussion of ethics, in some films, she reincarnates a fraudulent trickster or even a predatory serial killer, some kind of monstre moral. German Slavicist Raoul Eshelman notes a fundamental change in ethical thinking, which has been taking place in the narrative arts over the last 2 decades or so. While the positional mode of postmodernist ethics privileged the peripheral victim, the new ethical order, which he calls performatism, focuses on the perpetrator. In other words, the viewer or reader is forced to identify herself with the perpetrator, and he takes the example of the series Dexter. What else is significant in this new model is that ethical engagement necessarily involves visually mediated aesthetic projections or gestures, since these are the root forms of non-discursive communication or identification. At the same time, these aesthetic gestures necessarily have ethical consequences as soon as they move through form to touch someone else, that is to say, performam. So specific to Muratova, that the perpetrator is often a woman or someone or a child or someone who is traditionally represented passivity and victimhood. So, for example, the ethics of perpetration in Muratova's and Litvinova's in the film Ophelia. So the archivist of a maternal hospital with the bookish name Ophelia or Offa assumes the role of an avenging angel and murders those women who abandoned their children, newborn children. So she strangulates one young woman, and then she drowns her own mother, who once had abandoned Ophelia herself. Yeah, so it's kind of chain of mimetic murders and punishment. So, but Offa follows some code of rules, even if she made them up. Her ethical playbook is rooted in the archaic ethics of retaliation, or lex talionis, tit for tat, based on a logical procedure and calculation, revenge. And at times it's carried out to the point of absurdity, since retaliation can be based on false accusation, fabricated evidence, or simply on logical fallacy. Agamben convincingly shows how the ethics of retaliation precedes the Indo-European ethics, which is with its principle of personal guilt, culpa, so mea culpa. So the Indo-European ethics is based on the concept of culpa and the responsibility for one's own action, and on inevitable punishment for them. So like karma, like that's why Indo-European, not only European. In the archaic lex talionis, if there is no punishment, there would not be fault. In short, Litvinova's perpetrators are removed from the effect of culpa, for she is fate herself. Finally, her crimes acclaim an aesthetic value. She performs murders as spectacles. She dresses up, follows her victim, doubling their geometry of their movements. She mimics their actions. She's creating some kind of symmetry, and enacts beautiful bookish death, as she did for her mother, who died like Ophelia, to have a beautiful death. That's generally this idea, beautiful death will circulate in many of Muratova's films, kind of aestheticization of death. So my next point will be a kind of entirely different from what I was just said, and I don't know how to reconcile those 2 points, but nonetheless, I called it like counter to hegemonic visuality, and it's about the fact that Muratova's cinema represents a kind of gestural cinema that is rooted in ethical and political order, because it reaches far beyond the plot twists and towards the meta level of her filmmaking. Muratova masterfully experimented with the potential of cinematic image and challenged traditional forms of film narration, focusing on the bizarre, insignificant, marginal, tabooed, and those otherwise excluded from the Soviet and post-Soviet regime of representation. Muratova is known for her fondness for lay actors with their mannerism, quirks, odd voices, and intonation, their eccentric bodies, verbal and motor stereotypes. Nancy Condi refers to her characters as human mammals, feral mammals, while other critics call them a Kunstkammer of striking types with bizarre tics, gestures, and costumes, or simply freak shows. Actually, Muratova herself occasionally admitted to have a penchant for curiosity cabinets. Muratova's recasting of a hegemonic visuality is in all respects an ethical position. Her cinema offers to cite such aspects from which we usually turn our eyes away, exposing the obnoxious, the annoying, see the repressed, like death, nakedness, violence. In this cinema returns to some basal mode of excessive spectacle, or pageantry, as Oleg Aronson calls it, which does not fully belong in neither theater nor cinema, and in which narrative and performance, fiction and documentary fancifully coexist. This spectacle is closely related to early cinema and avant-garde experiments, to the cinema of attraction in Tom Gunning's terms. So practically all her films recreated regimes of visibility and inclusion of minorities in terms of class, gender, age, ethnicity, and nationality or disability. I'll just show you some images. Geographical periphery and the like, regardless of the ideological or political agendas of the moment. Minorities, by the way, should not create, again, the point of identification. So because this way they escape the kind of power relationship, yeah, because the identification immediately puts us in the power, and that's not what Muratova is interested in. So this idea of minorities is closer to the concept of the minor in Deleuze and Guattari. So by raising the question, what does it mean to be different, Muratova recasts normativity and debunks hierarchies or binary oppositions over and over again, placing them into a flux of differentiation or permutability. For instance, there is no stable separation between those with intellectual disabilities and without. They speak and act in a similar way. The difference children and adults is also undecidable. Kids are not bearer of some authenticity they can kill, as we know. What is more, the agency in Muratova's films is equally distributed among humans, animals, things, textures. These are found in a permanent flux in the relation of interdependence and rivalry for the field of visibility, and thus testify to an overall recognition of alterity. Incessant inclination or deflection. I called it once the cinema poetics of Muratova's poetic, the Abweichung, which I like a lot in German more than in other language, because Abweichung in German has this idea. The German word bears the meaning of a deviation, but from a straight line, but also to being soft, pliant, so tender, yeah, Abweichung. And of course, it's Abweichung, it's a deflection from normativity in Foucauldian sense, yeah. Do I still have 10 minutes? Yeah. It's a little bit of images of those undecidability. Yeah. I just wanted also to mention two more names in this regard. First of all, the Italian feminist philosopher Adriana Cavarero, who in her recent book, Inclinations, A Critique of Rectitude, contests the classical figure of a homo erectus, or upright man, whose verticality has served as an ideal ethical paradigm for Western philosophy since antiquity. So we can think of the moral straightness and rightness. Of course, it brings us back to this medieval logic of gesture I spoke at the beginning. So this type of subjectivity, all-pervading verticality entails an autonomous and egoistic self to whom the real access to alterity, to the other, is rendered impossible. So all deviations from this model of an upright vertical man are considered as suspicious, as a threat to the subject's equilibrium, a deep quiver, a slippery slope. Instead of this upright ethical posture, which happens to be masculine, as she says, Cavarero proposes an altruistic, open model of the subject, of course, a feminine subject, one who is inclined towards others, to the vulnerable and dependent, for exteriority requires going beyond one's own axis, to bend, to incline towards the other. And the classical example she takes, that's the mother bent over the child in Leonardo's The Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. To think Muratova's cinema in terms of postural geometry, postural ethics, it means that to think her in terms of inclination, in terms of gesture, and therefore to ascribe to it a profound political and ethical dimension. It's in Brief Encounters, it is Lübbe who makes a grand gesture by taking a leaf from the unfortunate love triangle she and Valentina got entangled in. At the end of Long Farewells, that's in this picture, on the contrary, the son kneels before his mother and promises for the time being not to leave her. In Sentimental Policeman, the policeman performs a helical dance on the cabbage field, like looking for an abandoned infant, like an amplified inclination and turning around, and just she finds her and inclines towards her. So, but Caballero's geometrical metaphor is quite static. It lacks dynamics. Therefore, the general line of Muratova's cinema, and my reference to Eisenstein in this case is not accidental general line. It's so the general line of her film would be a spiral or a zigzag. I'll show some images. As a kind of tautological curvature or repetition. That's from the film Change of Fate, Perestroika time. Sound is not that important, so that's why I don't switch it off. It will open. Yes, yeah. Okay. That's what I was telling about this general line of Muratova's ethical geometry. Let's say that's also from the film Three Stories about that murder. Yeah, and at the end, I would like to also evoke. Give you a reference to the my last point of reference. That's also one of the recent books by Erin Manning. It's called Minor Gesture, in which she embarks on a difficult task of a new neurodiverse philosophy. So Manning criticizes neurotypicality as founding identity politics and is geared to affirm the neurodiversity of the minor, also drawing on Deleuze and Guattari concept of the minor. So minor gesture is a force that problematizes normativity and creates sites of dissonance. That's the hello to Eugenie Zvonkin. And thus reorients experience to its potential variation and opens up to an alternative politics and new forms of knowledge. So Manning advocates for so-called autistic perception, to which Muratova has affinity as well. Autistic perception is not necessarily indicative of people with autism, although both Manning in her book and Muratova in her films explore the autistic point of view. This is rather about specific experience of the world, which doesn't deal with parsing, with analyzing of or abstraction of the whole through parts, but instead produces a new form of knowledge as experience informing. The world is in the process of its apparition to the consciousness before any categorization or verbalization is possible. That's what Irina was talking about. She writes, there is here as yet no hierarchical differentiation between color, sound, light, between human and non-human, between what connects to the body and what connects to the world. So in other words, Manning rehabilitates the non-conscious thought before it's put in words, language in the making, and non-conscious unintended movement, like in the case of motor apraxia. All that what is in the neurotypical model is considered as disability, the incapacity to act as an autonomous subject, as the master of one's act. So autistic perception is another way to treat ornamentalism, with which Muratova's cinema is often associated, as well as to recognize the interconnectedness of all the heterogeneous elements of her plentiful universe and her attention to minor details. So artistic perception leads to rethinking of subject, not as a cognizing, volitional, intending, thinking agent, but as a sensing, moving, synesthetic, and we can also add a haptic subjectivity. So she uses the word agencement, but it's okay, it doesn't matter. So proceeding from this autistic motor disturbance, Manning emphasizes that body-world split is endemic to the neurotypical account of experience, while in autistic perception, there is no such a clear subject-object distinction. Where does the body end and the world begin? bodies are interrelated with other bodies, with textures, objects. They are prolongations, offshoots of the environment. They constitute assemblage, swarms. This is why characters build numerous pairs and doubles, reduplications and dyads. This automatically shifts the focus on relations of interdependence, care, and responsibility for the others. Interestingly enough, an autistic subject is usually perceived as a solitary, opaque, and self-sufficient entity, unwilling to or unable to build any interpersonal relation. Yet cinema facilitates access to them and constructs these connections. Under certain angle, Muratova creates an ideal environment, a whaling ecology of a sweeping inclusion without discrimination, without hierarchies, a specific ethical order based not on action, but on gesture, precisely in operative gesture, consisting in non-acting, in suspension of action. It is there we find the human's care for the other in its most subtle and profound way. Thank you.